Great. Well, thanks very much, Mary, and Pranjali for the introduction and the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight in the virtual Burren. I really love the Burren in Bloom Festival because it's such a wonderful celebration of nature and wildlife and the natural world and the Burren, obviously, and community and coming together. So it was a fantastic idea to keep it going and to go online, to keep that tradition alive. And, you know, we're going through a very strange and challenging time at the moment. So I think it's particularly important to stay connected as much as possible. And hopefully we'll all be meeting up in person this time next year. So the theme that I'm talking about tonight is tiny towns and biodiversity, one of my favorite topics. And I'm basically just going to be sharing ideas of things that people can do in their towns and villages to protect and enhance biodiversity, and things we can all do to make a difference, to have a positive impact, either individually or within a tiny towns group or other community group. And I suppose, you know, many people seem to have found great solace in biodiversity and nature, in kind of connecting with nature during this whole COVID crisis situation. Many people have started noticing nature for the first time or for the first time in ages. And so maybe now is a good time to kind of stop and think and kind of reimagine our towns and villages and how, you know, they could be greener and wilder and better for the people that live in them, as well as for nature and wildlife. And I suppose I'm a big fan about talking about tiny towns. And, you know, what a lot of people don't realize is that tiny towns, it's a competition, but it's also a movement. There's a huge number of groups out there that are working for their communities and to improve the natural heritage and natural world in their towns and villages. Nearly 900 or over 900 entrants to the Tiny Towns competition last year. So it's absolutely vast and huge potential to make a difference. As Mary was saying, I'm an ecologist, I'm a botanist by training, but I'm also very privileged to be a national Tiny Towns adjudicator. It's something I absolutely love, and I'm blown away every year when I see the dedication and the hard work that Tiny Towns groups do throughout the country. Unfortunately, the competition's not running this year, but you can be sure that groups are still out there doing their bit for their community. So just, I imagine there's Tiny Towns people listening tonight, but there might be a few people who aren't Tiny Towns members. And, you know, just to kind of give a little bit of background, I mean, the ethos of the competition is really all about community spirit and building vibrant communities. And there's a huge emphasis on caring for the environment and the natural world. The competition has evolved hugely in recent years, and it's a very progressive competition. Some people can be a bit sort of sniffy about tiny towns, and they think it's just about picking up litter, and, you know, they don't realize that there's so much to it. We don't have time to go into it all tonight, but it's really, as I said, all about community building and spirit, and looking at all aspects of the environment and sustainability. And the competition is now, all the elements of the competition, the different categories, are now linked directly to the global sustainable development goals. There are 17 goals, and they include things like climate change or sustainability, protecting biodiversity, as well as huge issues like tackling poverty and health and well-being and all the rest of it. Goals that are easier to achieve when we've got strong and resilient communities. And I think Tiny Towns in its own way contributes to that in terms of community building. And there's just huge potential for positive change through the Tiny Towns movement. And I suppose I just wanted to point out, you know, for people who aren't involved in Tiny Towns, that, you know, there's the Tiny Towns group, but often they're deeply embedded in their communities, and kind of the good active Tiny Towns groups interact or work very closely with all the different groups in their area. So they might work with the Residents Association or the Men's Shed. They're often very involved in schools. So there's the potential for very far-reaching impact in the work that they do, and kind of leading by example and the positive influence that they can have. I suppose just if we're going to be talking about tidy towns and biodiversity, there's no harm just to remind ourselves what biodiversity is. And you know, often when you kind of ask people, they sort of panic a little bit because they feel it's something very highfalutin and a technical term. But really, it's just another word for nature and wildlife, or natural heritage, or the natural world. It also includes the places that plants and animals live, the habitats, and all the interconnections between living things and food chains. And I think the word, we have to kind of get to grips with it, because it emphasizes the importance of diversity, and there's huge evidence out there to show that we need that diversity. We can't afford to keep losing species, because they all have a role to play, and that diversity is key to how the natural world functions, natural systems. And biodiversity also emphasizes that people are part of this, you know, they're living things, they're part of biodiversity, and we depend on biodiversity. I was listening to a really inspiring webinar recently by Donald Sheehan of the Bride Project, in, I think it was the Farming with, or Farming for Nature webinar series, and he pointed out, which is absolutely true, that biodiversity is everywhere. It's not confined to, not just to the Burren, not to the nature reserves or national parks. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in on our doorsteps, our gardens. You know, it's the mold in your fridge. It's, you know, it's absolutely everywhere, and you don't have to go far to find it. I suppose, you know, I have to point out, when we're talking about biodiversity as well, that, you know, we are in a serious situation globally in terms of climate and biodiversity, that there's serious issues in terms, obviously, of climate change, but also biodiversity loss, with potentially huge consequences for people and kind of humankind. But we depend on the natural world for everything that we need: food, air, water, resources, and all the rest of it. I suppose the good news is that we can all make a difference, and it's the well-known kind of saying, think global and act local to make a difference. And Tidy Towns is all about that, you know, doing things locally and in the community, in their communities. I suppose now, because of the current kind of crisis in terms of biodiversity, we really need to think, you know, big and bold, and really, you know, work together to make a difference. There's huge pressures on our landscapes for all sorts of different conflicting needs. So we really need to make sure that our wild places are even wilder, and that we embrace nature and the natural world wherever it is, and try and ensure that we protect and enhance as much as we can. And obviously there's an onus on all sectors of society to protect biodiversity. Tonight we're just going to focus on kind of the action at a community level, and the lots of different things that we can do. And as I said before, I think Tidy Towns has the potential to make a real difference, because they can kind of lead by example, and show best practice, and raise awareness among their communities. So for the Tidy Town kind of nerds that are out there listening tonight, just to mention, I mean, there's various different categories in the competition. Biodiversity seeps into all of them really, but particularly into the biodiversity category, but also into sustainability and the green spaces and landscaping category. So it's not a standalone thing on its own. It interacts with all the different categories. That's in the sort of the competition side of things. So if we're thinking about biodiversity in our towns and villages, you know, where is it? You know, what are we talking about? And there's loads of places in urban spaces where nature thrives, or it could thrive if we looked after it. And I suppose if we're thinking about what we can do, we've got to think about, you know, how we can better manage and and enhance and protect nature and wildlife in our urban spaces, and maybe move away from kind of over managing and you know, manicuring sort of green spaces, and sort of appreciating a little bit more naturalness and a little bit wildness. But as you can see in the slide, you know, we're talking about road verges, parks, church grounds, old cemeteries, the you know, school grounds, all sorts of places, sports grounds that where nature is either thriving, or places that could be enhanced by doing, you know, practical things just to make them better spaces for biodiversity. And if we do make room for biodiversity in our urban spaces, our towns and villages, there's huge benefits for the local community. Nature brings in colour, life, texture, you know, it can kind of, especially in bigger urban spaces, it can kind of soften that whole kind of concrete jungle. It can be good for sort of health, clean air and all the rest of it, but also our mental health, just adding beauty, you know, and as I said, softening that kind of concrete jungle, providing places to relax and unwind and play and natural amenities. So it can be brilliant for the community as well as for nature and the natural world. And I think we have to embrace, you know, just things being, as I said before, a little less manicured and a little wilder when we're thinking about our green spaces. And what I hope to show is that, you know, by making space for biodiversity, you're going to save money. A lot of things that, you know, when you're working with nature cost a lot less, but you don't have to, you know, lose in terms of being, you know, in terms of being very attractive, making where towns and villages really beautiful. So going for a sort of a more natural approach, you can still have very beautiful green spaces. As I said, there's benefits for health. When you're working with nature rather than kind of trying to beat it into shape, you know, you're using less chemicals, you're less inputs, you're maybe mowing less and all the rest of it. So it's generally more cost effective, as I said, environmentally friendly and more sustainable. So what can we do to protect and enhance biodiversity in our urban spaces? And I'm just going to go through a few things you can do. I suppose the good news as well is that there's loads of information out there, and I'm just going to highlight a few things, I suppose, that I've kind of, you know, see it through my work as a Tiny Towns adjudicator and from working with community groups. And I suppose the first thing that you can do is really to stop and think and look around wherever you live and see what is there already that could be protected and enhanced. You know, what are there parks or sports grounds, you know, features like old veteran trees or holy wells or different spaces where nature either is thriving or could be enhanced by a bit of action. Some of these places mightn't look too pretty, the old bramble patch or a bit of old scrub, but they could be fantastic places for wildlife, and you might be able to highlight or celebrate some of those kind of places as well. And anybody from Ennis might recognise that aerial photograph. Here it is again. This is the interactive part of the webinar, and you're supposed to shout at the screen and tell me what you see in terms of habitats. And I suppose here in Ennis you can see the River Fergus. There's sports grounds. Often sports grounds can be great places around the edges or in the corners that are less used, that you can do something for nature. You can see there's bits of woodland along the river, bits of scrub. There's probably bits of wet areas as well, wet grassland and wetland. You know, so that's one of the first things to do is to look at your area and see what's there. This is a bigger urban space, but any town or village has some bit that you can work with, or that you can highlight and celebrate. I suppose another thing you can do is to kind of find out, are there any areas in or around where you live or your town and village that are designated for nature conservation? Or think about, you know, your natural heritage, but also your built heritage. Are there any protected monuments or structures? And a fantastic resource is heritagemaps.ie, where you can pull up maps of your area and find out all about it in terms of any sort of designations for nature. In this case, the River Fergus is part of a special area of conservation, which is fantastic if you've got that on your doorstep, because that means it's not just of local value for nature and wildlife, it's actually of international significance. So if you use something like that, it's absolutely wonderful to have in or near where you live. Another thing you can do is talk to your heritage officer. Most counties have a heritage officer. Bring up your local parks and wildlife ranger, talk to local experts. There's usually somebody around that you can ask, or environmental organizations. So consult with whoever you can find to find out a bit more about existing nature and wildlife in your area. And this is just a screenshot of this is Ennis again, and the heritage maps. And there's all these different layers, all these different data sets that you can pull up to see, are there any records of species or habitats in your area, or, as I said, designations. So there's loads of information you can find out just to get started and find out what's there. Because a lot of what you might be doing, whether it's a community group or a tidy town group or an individual, is sort of, you know, highlighting what's there or protecting something that's important, and if you need to know about it, and you can find out information. So another thing you can do is adopt a sort of a more wildlife friendly approach to landscaping or planting schemes. And most urban spaces have some form of landscaping or planting schemes or shrubberies and all the rest of it. And how can we improve the biodiversity value of that? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, you know, your flower beds or your planters or things like that in your town and village, and things that you can do. And then I'll move on to trees and hedgerows as well. Now I'm going to focus on pollinator-friendly landscaping, mainly because there's just fantastic resources out there. And probably most of you have heard of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, which is just a fantastic initiative. And it comes with all sorts of resources aimed at communities, gardeners, farmers, even to do with graveyards and golf courses, just everything there. And I suppose the handy thing is whatever is good for pollinators is generally good for wildlife. So you can use it depending on whatever you want to do for the benefit of biodiversity. All the actions in the pollinator plan are good for biodiversity in general. And it's just brilliant to have these resources that are just so well illustrated and explained. So pollinator-friendly landscaping, I suppose the good thing, you know, is it can be absolutely stunningly beautiful. So you're not sacrificing anything in terms of the wow factor in your landscaping or your planting schemes. I mean, I'm a gardener, I'm mad into gardening, and I want my garden to look absolutely fab, you know, and I want colour and interest and all the rest of it. And you can get that in a wildlife-friendly garden. You don't have to go completely, you know, to let it all to nettle patches or something like that. You can still have a beautiful space and be good for wildlife, good for the environment, much more sustainable. And even better is that it tends to be much more cost effective as well. And I think we have to, you know, move away from basically going out and buying shed loads of the summer bedding. You know, it's fine and it has its place, but we have to sort of wean ourselves off buying tons and tons of summer bedding for our kind of planting schemes in towns and villages. And basically a pollinator-friendly or a wildlife-friendly approach, you're going to be using more perennials. And I suppose the good news again is that, you know, the things that the bees and the butterflies like, they like, as I said, beautiful, colourful flowers, just like we do, you know, so you can still have fantastic planting schemes. You know, there's nothing wrong with formal beds, but you might consider sort of a more naturalistic planting style. When you're thinking a little bit more about structure in your planting, which can again look fantastic, but it's just providing more spaces for all the insects and shelter and all the rest of it that'll come and visit your flower beds. And think about seasonality. so that you're basically aiming for flowers and colour for much of the years, because bees and butterflies and all the pollinators, they need food pretty much year round. So having flowers just for 6 weeks or 8 weeks in the summer is no good. But again, if you know, from a town or village point of view and a planting scheme, if you have a scheme that gives you colour for months in the year, that's absolutely fantastic. So adopting that sort of seasonality is good for wildlife, but it's good for us as well. So obviously you're going to look at your existing landscaping schemes. You might already have some pollinator plans in there. And the pollinator plan, if you look at their website, they've got lists and lists of what are the pollinator friendly plants, so you can easily find out. And also then look and see in your planting schemes, are there opportunities to plant more? And the emphasis would be on perennials, and there's loads of gorgeous ones, the hellebores and all the rest of it. But there are some annuals, and annuals have their place as well, that are good for pollinators. So for some types of planting schemes where there's a lot of traffic and things can get disturbed, you know, you might be better off putting in a few annuals, or for window boxes and things like that. And as I said, you can get absolutely beautiful results from pollinator friendly planting, or for wildlife friendly planting. This is a slide from Emer Fox, who's a landscape architect, and you can see just the gorgeous effect there, and the plants at the bottom of the screen that are pollinator friendly. So, you know, you can mix and match and do all sorts of wonderful things. And, you know, a lot of those perennials, you'll get maybe, if you look after them, you could get 10 to 12 years out of them. You might just need to clip them back at the end of the growing season, and they'll come back. And I've tried and tested all of this in my own garden, and it's just fantastic seeing them coming back again, and sometimes even better and stronger. And you can see that you can save a lot of money by not having to go out every year and buy loads of annuals or summer bedding. This is a nice biodiversity garden in Carrick-on-Shannon. And they've got a gorgeous mix of pollinator friendly plants, and they're raising awareness among their communities. Absolutely wonderful, and it's a fantastic example of what a Tiny Towns group can do. I suppose what I'd like to see is that, you know, we don't just have a biodiversity friendly bed in our you know, Tidy Towns projects or in our town and village, but we look at all of our landscaping and planting. Why shouldn't it all have some value for nature and wildlife, just to, you know, really increase that biodiversity value throughout all our planting? It doesn't mean you throw out what you have, but you might over time, you know, tweak it and enhance it and make sure that everything has some value for biodiversity, as well as all the other functions it might be doing, like screening and shelter, or, you know, different jobs that you might need your landscaping to do. But I think it's not just one area for biodiversity. Let's have biodiversity friendly planting everywhere. And this is just some examples. This is up in Westport, and in Westport, in fairness to them, they've been doing kind of biodiversity or pollinator friendly planting for years, long before we had the pollinator plan. This sort of textured planting with a lot of basically using a lot of perennials, and it looks absolutely fantastic. It's not necessarily that tricky to do, and as I said, there's great advice out there. I think this is down in Waterford. This is just a slide from the pollinator plan. Looks absolutely stunning and great for wildlife. And again, another example. So you can see that you can have colour, you can have the wow factor, and, you know, the added bonus is that it's great for attracting bees and butterflies and moths and all the rest of it. And then when you have a good insect fauna flying about the place, it's good for birds, good for small mammals. Lots of things are benefiting from your pollinator friendly planting. I suppose another thing to think about is just the style of planting. And you see in the top left the begonias there, and, you know, a lot of people are really fond of the begonias, and that's absolutely great. And if you love begonias, you can still plant a few begonias, but we do need to sort of start moving away, as I said, from completely relying on all our planting on summer bedding and maybe planting sort of single species. The double flat flowered, very showy annuals really have absolutely no value for pollinators. They can look very, very brightly coloured, and that's great. But it doesn't mean you have to throw them out altogether, but maybe introduce a few pollinator-friendly plants as well. And then look at your planting style. As I said, a bit of structure and texture is good for attracting wildlife as well. So the top right example there is just an absolutely beautiful planting scheme that's great for wildlife. Looks fantastic, really fits in with the setting, and that would be a more naturalistic style. But if you like the formal, you can have that too. The bottom two examples, you have the lovely lavender bed in front of a council building, and then the other example are wallflowers, which you get lovely late flowering plants there, but in a formal bed, and great for pollinators as well. As I said before, you know, you're aiming to have flowers all year round, and isn't that fantastic in you know, in your urban space, your town and village, or your tiny town project, to really have colours, not just when the adjudicators are visiting, because obviously you're doing it for your community, and it's great if you can, you know, extend that flowering season. And with a bit of careful maintenance, as clipping them back at the end of the flowering season, they'll all come back again. And as I said, that website, pollinators.ie, just has fantastic information out there, step by step, lists of plants and all the rest of it. So, you know, it's not too tricky to do, and you don't have to transform everything in one fell swoop. You can do it gradually over time. I just want to you know, mention planters and pots and window boxes and all the rest of it, and the good old hanging baskets, which are all a feature of landscaping, or of landscaping in our towns and villages. And I suppose it's good to make the point that there's a whole range of scales. You know, not everybody has parks and big screen spaces that they can use for planting up, and sometimes we have much smaller spaces. And so that's great, you know, we can use planters and pots and all the rest of it. There is an emphasis, I should say, in the Tiny Towns competition to move away from relying too much on kind of planters, and particularly hanging boxes, hanging baskets and window boxes, because they do require a lot of watering. And sometimes if we go completely mad with loads and loads of planters and baskets, it can add a lot of clutter, you know. But that's very much a Tiny Towns issue. But, you know, where you have planters, you can combine your pollinator perennials and annuals to great effect. So you can have pollinator-friendly planting in very small spaces as well. But as I said, you want to use planters sparingly. They have very high watering requirements, and we'll all know about that with the recent dry weather. And also, you know, if you really want to adopt a kind of an overall holistic biodiversity friendly approach, you want to avoid peat-based compost, because obviously that's coming from our bogs, and there's some very good Irish alternatives that you get that are non-peat based, potting compost. And as I said, you want to avoid adding clutter by going, you know, too many planters, but in the right place they can really make a positive impact. And as I said, this just says some examples of pollinator friendly annuals, and I have them in my own window box on my house, and really they're absolutely hopping, and particularly the Bidens, which is the yellow one on the bottom there. The bees absolutely love it. Just going back to planters again, or large pots and all the rest of it, really they're for places where there's hard landscaping and you want to add a little bit of colour and a bit of interest. Or they can be used very effectively if you want to direct people where it's safe to cross, or, you know, there are lots of different functions. But if you've got grass or soil, you're much better off planting directly into the grass, not putting a planter there, because if you're having to water, unless you're harvesting rainwater, you really shouldn't be relying on tap water, because that's obviously not very sustainable if you're using water that has to be treated to water your planting scheme. So really you're better off planting directly into the ground as much as possible. But there are plenty of instances where, you know, a well-placed planter, often the larger the better, and they're much easier to keep well hydrated. Other ideas you see out there, and again this comes from the pollinator plan, you know, and are fantastic in an urban space, is a kind of a public herb garden where people can come and pick herbs, you know, something that the community can benefit of. And I've seen some really nice examples of that around the country. And there's lots of our herbs that we use in cooking that look absolutely gorgeous, lovely leaves, lovely fragrance. They're brilliant in sensory gardens, and they're fabulous for pollinators as well. So there's just endless. We could talk all night about pollinator friendly or wildlife friendly gardening. And as I said, there's great resources out there. I'm sticking with the pollinator theme, but as I keep emphasizing, it's good for wildlife in general and also good for the environment. And I just want to talk about managing grassland. And most towns and villages have some class of green space, road verges, school grounds, parks, all the rest of it. And one of the key things that we can do that really is very, very easy to do is just reduce mowing frequency. So the first example I'm going to talk about are areas where you do have high amenity value and there's a lot of traffic and footfall and all the rest of it. So you need to keep the grass low because people are using it, but you can just maybe look at your mowing frequency and tweak it a little bit, reduce it a little bit, and allow things like the clovers and the buttercups and the dandelions to flower. So just pushing out your mowing frequency, adding a week or two where you can. It can look really nice as if a few more things flowering. It doesn't have to be just pure green grass. Obviously, you're saving money on your petrol costs, you have lower environmental impact, you know, so there's huge benefits. So easy to do, and you can have great results. And I've done this on my own lawn as well, and it is amazing, you know, just leaving an extra week or two, and your garden is hopping, and it can be full of and it's amazing, things that you never knew were there will pop up, all sorts of, you know, the red and the white clovers, if you're lucky, the cowslips, birds foot trefoil if you're in the burren and you're on the lime-ear soils. But you know, no matter what soils you have, no matter how fertile, chances are something will pop up and flower, the old dandelions. And you know, even gardeners like myself are learning to embrace the dandelion. I used to mow the, you know, be quick out with the mower to mow it, but you know, it's just fantastic for the bees. We just have to embrace them and let them flower. The next option is for areas that don't have such heavy traffic, you know, that are road verges or roundabouts or quiet corners and parks, so there isn't much footfall, that you could leave longer grass and basically create a kind of a meadow grassland. And again, this is a really easy thing to do, low cost, and it's just about managing the existing grassland. You don't have to go buying any flower seed, or there's no inputs. It's just allowing the grass to grow longer. And again, you might think there's no wildflowers there, but if you leave the grass grow and manage it in a certain way, you'll be surprised what comes up. And this is just from the photos, just from a roundabout in Ennis. But roundabouts, as I said, quiet corners and parks and graveyards along boundary walls, there's loads of places that maybe we could just leave unmown, you know, edges of walls, lots of places like that in towns and villages. And the results can be really, really attractive, and the impact is absolutely massive. We're mowing way too much grassland. There's loads of areas that could easily be left unmown and would have no impact in terms of amenity. value, that you still have plenty of grass for people who are walking and playing and all the rest of it. So the key thing is just let the grass grow, mow it once a year, ideally late in the season. And the idea is that you're allowing things to flower and set seed. But you mow it at the end of the growing season, and the key thing is then to remove the grass clippings. And the lads who are mowing the grass, and it's usually the lads, I suppose, you know, often the great community employment scheme workers, it's a bit of a hassle, but it really makes a difference, because the idea is that you're reducing the fertility of the grassland and promoting the wildflowers that are already there. You're not having planting any seed, and just so that the grass doesn't, it's going to be much more vigorous. You're reducing the fertility, so the grass is outcompeted, and the flowers will become more abundant, basically. And as I said, you can have absolutely fantastic results. You might find in areas that have very rich soils or heavy soils or fertile soils that you might need to mow twice a year. And I do that on my own garden, because I've obviously got very fertile soil. So I mow it, you know, early in the season before things are like May or April, early as I can. Then I don't mow it, and then mow again at the end of the growing season. But you can experiment and see. But you will find over time that more and more wildflowers will be blooming. These are shots again from Ennis, but I know there's plenty of groups throughout Clare and other counties that are taking this approach, and see all sorts of lovely wildflowers coming up. And it's amazing. Those two photos, which were very kindly given to me by the Tidy Towns group in Ennis, were just after a year, you know, that all sorts of things, cowslips and oxeye daisies, came out. These are just a few more. They wanted to highlight what they were doing by putting up sculptures, and I've seen that in other parts of the country as well. This is just an example from GAA grounds in Portlaoise, where they just had a bit of land that they didn't need, you know, obviously for sporting purposes. And it just looks absolutely fantastic, and it's not compromising any future uses if they need that in the future. There's loads of GAA grounds that have areas that really don't need to be mowed, but are just mowed anyway. In some cases, sprayed. So maybe just leave the grass and see what happens, and it can look absolutely fantastic. And in this case, they mowed a path through it as well, which looks fab. Just some more examples, you know, where you can have a nice cut edge near your path so that it looks like you're doing it deliberately, and then you don't need to mow all of it, leave the rest of the grass, and lots of nice things. In this case, you've got knapweed and other things, meadowsweet coming up, and it can look really attractive. Because I know that the guys are cutting the grass, sometimes they get grief for leaving areas like this because people think that it's just that they can't be bothered. So you could put up a little sign just to highlight what you're doing, you know, saying that it's being managed for wildlife. It's not that you couldn't be bothered cutting the grass, but that this is for the benefit of wildlife. And as I said, I think it looks absolutely fantastic. I suppose just to end on talking about meadows and meadow grassland, and you'll note that I'm not covering planting by wildflower seed, and you can do it, and there's great guidance out there, but it's much harder work because a lot of our wildflowers like poor soils that aren't very fertile. And what people find is they plant things by seed, looks absolutely fantastic the first year, and then next year the grass is back with a vengeance, and after a couple of years they can't see where they planted the seeds at all. It takes a lot of managing if you're planting by seed, and there's the cost involved. And it might say on the packet that it's native wildflower seed, but is it native to your area, you know, and your type of soil? So you'd need to put a lot of effort and research into it. I've seen it done very successfully, but I've seen a lot of examples where, you know, it would have been a lot easier to do just managing the grassland that is there, or in some cases even, you know, there probably was a better habitat there to begin with, and it was scraped out of the way and seed sown. So that would be just my word of caution if you're planting by seed. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And I suppose the other thing, I just put this slide up. This is what a native wildflower meadow, this is from a particular, this is sort of more on acidy soils. in Galway, near where I live, you'll notice there's no poppies or cornflowers, you know, which are annuals. These are all perennials, and it doesn't maybe look as showy, but to me it's absolutely beautiful. And that's what our native wildflower meadows can look like. And that was not planted by seed. That was just grass that was allowed to grow. In this case, it's grazed, but you can get the same effect by mowing. And my final word in relation to pollinators, this isn't quite so much to do with grassland or managing grassland, but just the value of ivy for pollinators just cannot be overstated. And we have bees in our garden, and any beekeeper will tell you they can see the ivy honey, because ivy flowers very late in the season. So it's absolutely fantastic for bees who need to stock up before winter, and the beekeepers can even see that contribution in terms of the honeybees. But of course, we've all the native bees as well. So, you know, we're sort of devils in Ireland for sort of trying to get rid of ivy and pulling it and cutting it and all the rest of it. But it's a huge, huge value for wildlife. I just wanted to make that point. And so the next thing we can do, we've covered a couple of topics, the landscaping and the managing grassland, but one of the best things that you can do for wildlife in general, but also pollinators, is planting native trees and shrubs. And we don't have a huge number of native trees and shrubs in Ireland, but we have some really beautiful ones. And the examples I've shown here are ones that flower and are good for pollinators, but we've all sorts, depending on where you live or where your town or village is, that will suit your area. So they can be good for birds, bats, small mammals, but they also look absolutely fantastic. And, you know, most of them can grow very well in an urban space. The bottom left-hand corner, the rowan tree there, one of my favourite native trees, and you find it growing in uplands, you find it on acidy soils, you find it in the burren. It's an incredibly hardy tree. It looks just gorgeous in urban spaces as well. The good old hawthorn, which is coming to flower now, is just absolutely beautiful and so hardy. And that the final example is the bird cherry, which isn't so common, but very, very beautiful as well. And the great thing about the old native trees is they're cheap and cheerful to buy. They're hardy. They will survive whatever the climate in Ireland throws at them. So they can be absolutely fantastic. You know, in an urban space, it's absolutely fine to grow non-natives as well. And it doesn't mean you should cut down all your non-native trees and shrubs, but it just means if you are tree planting or you have an area with trees, just to include a few natives as well, because they've huge value for our native wildlife. Looking at the time here now, so I better start speeding on a little bit. This is just a few more pics of some of our native, the spindle with the lovely pink berries, the gorgeous holly, which is again very hardy species, one of our only really common broadleaf native evergreen, the gelder rose with the beautiful bright red berries, and the elder, which is also coming into flower. Absolutely gorgeous. And as I said, huge benefits for wildlife in general, but also huge benefits for the environment. And often, you know, particularly hedges and trees near watercourses can be part of sort of the natural flood control capacity, good for climate, pulling in, sucking up carbon sequestration, mitigating climate change. And I would argue they're fantastic for people as well. I mean, you really notice towns and villages and urban spaces that have trees. They're just really soften the urban environment. They're good for our mental health, just give us, you know, bringing nature into those urban spaces, that color and texture, you know, softening that concrete jungle, helping us relax and unwind. You know, they're just good for our physical and mental health as well. And in Ireland, we really need more trees everywhere. You know, we've got a very low tree cover. It's one of the simplest things to do, and we should be doing much more of it. You see European countries and they have trees and, you know, all sorts of massive cities, so why can't we have more of them in ours and in our urban spaces, not to mention the countryside. there is advice out there, because the key thing and the tricky thing, the one tricky thing to do with the tree is getting the right tree in the right place. So matching the species with the soil and the space that you have and the job that you want it to do. And there is advice out there, and a couple of publications from Clare County Council that are very easy to get, but they work for anywhere in the country more or less. But it's just planting. It's a forester's motto: right tree in the right space. And the Clare County Council also produced guidance in terms of designing with trees in towns and villages, and you know, how to make a kind of an entrance to your town or village, or by planting, or in housing estates, or all different scenarios. And there's lots of technical information on tree planting as well. And I just want to whiz through a couple of examples, just while we're on a Burn in Bloom, just a couple of Clare examples. This fantastic project in Kilrush is a brilliant Tidy Towns group there. And I had the privilege of working with them as facilitating when they were developing their biodiversity plan. And somebody who was part of the Tidy Towns group had the idea, why don't we plant one tree per child in the town? And they've been doing that, I think, for at least 3 years. And it's absolutely fantastic idea, great way to involve children and the community. You know, there's just so many boxes ticked by a project like that in terms of raising awareness and learning, and not to mention that planting hundreds and hundreds of trees, and it's just absolutely brilliant. And I have a few more examples that I'll show later on from other projects around the county. Just wanted to make the point that if you're hedging, putting in hedging, whether it's in housing or in a village or town setting, you know, we're used to all the typical examples that you see in the garden centres, the broadleaf evergreens, but there's lots of native hedging that can look absolutely fantastic in an urban situation. And they mightn't be, you know, green all year round, but a lot of them will fruit and flower and nuts and berries and all the rest of it. And they're just fabulous for wildlife, and you can clip them and manage them as a sort of a neat hedgerow if that's what you're looking for, but you're also enhancing the wildlife value where you're planting them. Now, that's not the best photo in the world, but it's just showing a car park with trees and shrubbery, and it really softens the kind of a large urban space having trees. It just looks so much better. And a beautiful village green with trees. It just, I think, looks absolutely beautiful. And what I like about this photo is that they weren't tempted to plant flowers under the trees. You know, trees are beautiful in their own right, and flowers aren't really meant to grow under trees like that. Put them in a different space, let the tree shine on its own, and it just looks absolutely fantastic. It really enhances that village green. And another example, in a hard landscaping where trees are planted well and are looking fantastic. They haven't been over trimmed or pruned. They're just allowed to grow and look absolutely beautiful. And of course, a few flowers as well. Just another community project. We're coming back to Ennis again, but I've seen this in other places in Clare and around the country where they've planted community orchard, just planting fruit trees. In this case, it was in a housing estate, but in any kind of green space or public space, people can come and pick the fruit. Fantastic community project, also wonderful for wildlife, for birds, and if you don't mind sharing the fruit with the birds, and for pollinators. I suppose one of the really important things we need to do for more biodiversity friendly towns and villages is we have to reduce our use of chemicals, and I mean herbicides and pesticides and all of those things that we like spraying around the place. And I suppose one thing I have noticed, while people are really kind of embracing nature at the minute in the COVID crisis, there just seems to be a lot of spraying around the place, and we really have to move away from that and put up with sort of a few weeds, or what we think of as weeds, you know, because these chemicals are bad for the environment, they're bad for our for our health, for human health, and they're terrible for wildlife, especially pollinators. So we really have to look and think, is it necessary? Why are we doing it? Are there other ways of doing it? And maybe, you know, what we think of as weeds are really wildflowers. And personally, I think lots of brown sprayed vegetation just looks terrible. It's very unsightly. And really we should only be using them where they're absolutely essential. Things like invasive species really is probably the only way to control some of them. Or if there's weeds in kind of bigger urban spaces that you can't pull that might trip people up. But apart from that, I just wonder really, you know, are they necessary? Because, you know, they really have a negative impact on the environment. So we do need to ease off and avoid, and maybe just stop altogether using these chemicals where possible. Another thing to do, and I'm really focusing, you know, thinking about towns and villages. Well, obviously it's for everywhere, but a lot of towns and villages have streams or ditches or canals or bits of water flowing through them. And it's really important to protect these watercourses because they're hugely important for wildlife, but also as providing water resources. This photo looks like you're out in the countryside. It's actually a large town in Ireland, and I just loved it when I drove over the bridge, and I could see that all the riparian vegetation, the vegetation growing along the riverside, was left naturally. On either side of that river there's car parks and buildings, but you can't see them because they've left the riparian vegetation, and that's not always possible. But where possible at all, we need to protect the edges of rivers and streams and lakes, because it's hugely important. The watercourses and that vegetation that grows beside it, hugely important for as a wildlife habitat, but also for protecting water quality. Maintaining those fringes of sort of wilder vegetation next to water is very important. A lot of these watery, wet places are really beautiful. They really add to our towns and villages, but we need to maybe not manicure right to the water's edge, leave them a little bit more naturally, and really protect water, prevent any soil erosion or any washing or inwash of materials into rivers and streams, because they're so important for wildlife, but they're also important for us because ultimately we get our drinking resources from these wet places. They can be very important for natural amenities, and a lot of that sort of, if we allow nature to thrive around the edges of water as well as in it, you know, it can really make them more beautiful and more attractive for us as we experience them, and fantastic for wildlife. And these are just a few pictures just to show how, you know, in an urban setting where you have water, you know, or maybe a river walk or natural amenity or park, you can have your mowed edge, but allow that riparian vegetation or that riverside vegetation just to grow wild. And it just prevents any erosion of soil or other, you know, materials washing into those water bodies. And as I said, that riparian vegetation really protects again any decline in water quality, and also it's just part of the natural flood control capacity, you know, of an area. So it's really important to protect it, and they're hugely important for wildlife. So also trying to avoid maybe going for the hard edging next to water bodies, and minding all those wetlands. There's some beautiful flowers like the yellow flags in the picture there, or the purple loosestrife, and many others, meadowsweet and all the rest of it, that like to grow along river edges. Allow them to flower and bloom, and they can look gorgeous. Okay, just we're getting close to the end time, but we're nearly there. Just another thing you can do, and I wasn't going to go into too much detail here, but it's something that a lot of groups like doing, kind of creating habitats and nesting sites. And it's an absolutely fantastic thing to do, whether it's putting up bird boxes, putting up bat boxes, building bug hotels. We went a bit mad on the old bug hotels in the tidy towns, and we had great fun building them and putting them in place. I suppose what the pollinator plan that the people in the Biodiversity Data Centre have found, that some of those really large bug hotels are actually do more harm than good, because they've just become a focus for disease. So what they're really emphasising now is the smaller bug hotels. And I suppose what I just wanted to make the point for this slide was really, there's loads of good information out there, whether it's you're building a bug hotel on pollinators.ie, and now the emphasis is on kind of small is beautiful. If you're putting up a bird box, which can be a great thing to do, it's great for raising awareness and reminding people that there's birds around. Birdwatch are very good guidance. You know, birds are shy creatures. They don't want to be out in a pole in the middle of a housing estate. They want to be where there's trees and shrubs where they can sort of sneak out. And, you know, if they're raising their young in a nesting box, they do want that bit of privacy and cover. So where you put the nesting box is very important, not just any old place or any old tree. And the same is true of bats. It can be a real addition, particularly say if an old tree had to be felled, you know, putting up bat boxes can be a wonderful thing. But do get good advice, and there's great advice out there, so that what you're doing is really adding value and that you're going to have good results, and monitor it, you know, and see and enjoy, you know, is your bird box being used, you know, and what bugs are in your bug hotel. Have a poke around and see what's crawling out of it, and have a bit of fun. And then finally, one of the most important things that you can do as a Tidy Towns group or a community group or even in an individual is to raise awareness among your community. We need to change attitudes, you know, about, say, for example, landscaping and manicuring and moving to a more wildlife friendly approach, whether it's using chemicals, whether it's protecting water, you know. So raising awareness is, you know, cannot be underestimated. It's hugely important. And it's one thing that Tidy Towns are very good at doing, you know, whether it's running nature walks and talks, which is just fantastic. And from a competition point of view, that can go into your application and you definitely get points for it. Whether it's putting up interpretive signage, you know, I would caution against putting signs up all over the place because it can add a load of clutter. But well placed, well researched and informative signs or booklets or whatever way you want to do it can really be great at raising awareness. You know, if you're going for the don't mow, let it grow approach, you know, put a little sign up. Again, you don't want to clutter it with signs, but let people know why you're letting the grass grow long so that you don't get inundated with complaints that you couldn't be bothered cutting the grass, that, you know, that you have good reason, and people will appreciate that and enjoy it, and they might do it in their own garden, you know, and that's a really positive influence. This is just an example from Newmarket and Fergus Tidy Towns. This is just an example from Clare Castle, which is another fantastic, there's loads of fantastic groups out there where they are sharing information with their community, and they're taking a very holistic approach and very much a Burren Bio type of approach. And I know they did their biodiversity plan with Burren Bio, and they're looking at heritage as a whole, the natural heritage and the built heritage, and sharing information and ideas and inspiring their community, which is absolutely fantastic, through their website. And this is just another example, again, sort of a natural amenity. Lots of Tidy Towns groups are trying to develop natural amenities, and this is a bog walk, which I haven't done, but I'm looking forward to doing someday in Connolly, and another fabulous Tidy Towns group there, where they're looking to learn more about it. They're really interested in managing this area to best practice and sharing it with their community and just enjoying it and getting out there and enjoying nature. And I think that's just fantastic. And I suppose to conclude, you know, there's the loads that we can do as individuals or community groups or Tidy Towns. There is good information out there. And I think really, you know, if we want to protect and enhance biodiversity, we really need to inform and share and raise awareness. People will protect what they love and what they care about. So we need, you know, to basically to share that love of the natural world with our communities, which is something that I think Burren Bio are fantastic at doing, and there's other groups out there, but I think we need to clone Burren Bio and hopefully get other bio groups out there, because they're really good at inspiring people with all the things that they do, particularly things like Burren in Bloom. And Tidy Towns groups are also very well placed out there to share and inspire with their communities. if you're not in a Tidy Towns group, I would encourage you to find out where they are and who they are and join and get involved, because I just think they're fantastic and they do so much work that people might not appreciate, and there's so much potential to, you know, get involved with the community and really have a positive impact. So thanks very much for listening. I see Mary has popped up there. So
hi Janice, thank you. That was fantastic. We got lots of lovely comments. People really enjoyed that talk, and also there was quite a few questions which we won't get to many of, but just to put one to you, Janice. What is the biggest obstacle that faces Tidy Towns groups when it comes to embracing biodiversity?
Well, that's a really big question. I mean, the biggest obstacle that confronts Tidy Towns groups in general is recruiting volunteers. I know that's not exactly answering your question, but you know, that's what they really need, is people to get involved. You know, in terms of biodiversity, it's knowledge, you know, and information and advice, and sometimes they feel a little bit overwhelmed, you know, and so whatever we can do, whether, you know, there's a lot of people out there that have knowledge, there's lots of good gardeners and or beekeepers or bird watchers, if they'd only get involved with their Tidy Towns group and share the knowledge, you know. But it's also for people, there's, you know, people have a particular way of doing things, you know, and they've always done it that way, and so it can be difficult to change attitudes, and things won't change overnight. So sometimes we need to be a little bit patient, and I've seen all sorts of things that, you know, I might sort of despair a little bit, but it's just gently bringing people along. And, you know, I think this is where Tidy Towns groups can kind of lead by example, you know, and show best practice. But really what they need is volunteers and support. But there is an information gap out there, but I think that's, I know I've gone on a lot about the pollinator plan, but what was brilliant about that is that they just provided such easy to follow resources, you know, and there are a lot of resources out there in general, but sometimes you can kind of be overwhelmed when you Google things, and you can find all sorts of advice that's for, you know, parts of England that don't really relate to here, you know, so we just need to support them as much as possible.
Thank you, Janice. That was a wonderful talk. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can see you better? No problem. Looks like we are running out of time. So there are lots of compliments on your talk, and people have really enjoyed it and benefited from it. I'll just unfortunately finish with the last question for the evening. Is there funding available for towns that want to carry out this work? Is a question from Anonymous.
Yeah, well, that's always the question, is where, you know, because people, you know, Tidy Towns groups need money to function. And, you know, I suppose the first point I'd make is that there's a lot of things that you can do with a low budget. And the handy thing is when you work with nature, you know, when nature's your friend, a lot of these things do not cost a lot of money. But having said that, you know, you do need a bit of money. And, you know, it's just the constant challenge. There are little pockets of money out there, from whether it's local Agenda 21 funding, whether it's there's little pockets of money that come available every year for Tidy Towns groups. Often you have to be part, or other community groups. I mean, I know there's lots of groups that do things that, you know, if you're on the public participation network in your local authority, you can get funding. You know, there's little pockets that appear. The Tree Council give funding, the National Parks and Wildlife. There's a Heritage Council have given money in the past. You just need to keep your finger on the pulse and see where, you know, sometimes say during Tree Week there can be free trees. It can be a blessing and a curse though, you know, sometimes with people chasing the money all the time. Really, you need to stop and think, what do you want to do? Have a good plan, and then when funding becomes available, you can go for it. I should mention, you know, there is leader funding, you know, for biodiversity specifically, and in Clare, particularly the fantastic leader company that are really willing to and really want to, you know, facilitate groups. That's for the bigger projects, and you really need to have thought it through, and there's paperwork and all the rest of it, but they are there to help you. So don't let the money stand in your way. There's loads of things you can do without money. I know that's easy for me to say, and everybody wants to find a bit, but there, you know, talk to your local part, there's often somebody that works in the council that supports Tidy Towns groups, and they will put you in touch with funding.
Okay.